Total War: Thrones of Britannia should have been a masterpiece, a game that finally zoomed in on one of the most fascinating periods of British history, the Viking invasions of the 9th century. It promised a smaller scope, deeper mechanics, and a more personal Total War experience, but what we got was something else. A game that we may now call one of the worst in the entire franchise. A game that divided the fanbase, disappointed history buffs, and left the Saga spin-off brand dead on arrival. So, today we're going to ask the question, WTF happened to Thrones of Britannia? How did the game with so much promise crash and burn so badly, and what lessons does it hold for the future of Total War? When Thrones of Britannia was announced in 2018, it wasn't just stepping into an empty market, it was stepping into the shoes of one of the most beloved and long-running strategy franchises in gaming, Total War. To understand why the receptions to Thrones was so brutal, we need to understand the context of where the series stood at the time. The Total War franchise began in 2000 with Shogun Total War. Even back then, the formula was revolutionary, a combination of real-time battles and turn-based empire management. Unlike most strategy games of the late 90s and early 2000s, Total War wasn't just about moving armies on a map. It was about commanding them on a battlefield, and it looked like something out of a movie. That duality, grand strategy plus cinematic combat, became the DNA for the franchise. Over the next decade, the series built a loyal fan base with the entries like Medieval Total War, Rome Total War, and Medieval 2 Total War. Each game became a cultural landmark for strategy fans. Rome Total War in particular, from 2004, was a breakout success. It took historical strategy into the mainstream. It even became an educational tool, with the History Channel licensing its engine for TV documentaries. Players like me were obsessed, not just because it was fun, but because it felt like history coming alive. But with the success came bigger ambition. In 2009, Creative Assembly released Empire Total War, which tried to push the franchise into the gunpowder era, adding naval battles for the first time. The idea was ambitious, but the launch was plagued with bugs, crashes, and AI issues. It set a pattern. When Total War overreached, the execution often fell short. Fans learning to both love and fear new releases, and that started to become a trend over the next few years. Then came Shogun 2 in 2011, which many still call the gold standard of Total War design. It was focused, polished, and balanced, tight in scope but rich in depth. And this proved a key lesson. Total War worked best when it narrowed its focus and doubled down on detail, rather than sprawling endlessly. Ironically, this was the same philosophy that Thrones of Britannia would later claim to adopt, but unfortunately failed to deliver. In 2013, the franchise attempted another giant leap, Rome 2. The hype was astronomical. Fans expected the spiritual successor to Rome 1 to be bigger and better in every way. Instead, though, the launch was near unplayable. The AI was broken, graphics unfinished, and performance disastrous. The backlash was huge, and for a while, Rome 2 Total War became the most hated game in the franchise. Yet over the years, Creative Assembly patched it, released DLC, and slowly rehabilitated its reputation. By 2016, many players considered Rome 2 good enough, though its launch disaster still left scars. In 2015, Total War Attila released as something of a spin-off or a follow-up to Rome 2. Unlike Thrones, Attila succeeded because it had a strong identity. It wasn't just Rome 2 but smaller. It was about survival during the collapse of the Roman Empire. The game leaned into bleakness, disease, migration, climate change, and the barbarian invasions. Attila was definitely punishing but memorable for fans, and people loved it. Many fans argue it's the most atmospheric Total War game ever made. But meanwhile, another seismic shift was happening. In 2016, we got Total War Warhammer. For the first time, we'd left history entirely behind and embraced a fantasy side. Many fans were skeptical at first, but Warhammer became a massive hit, drawing in new audiences, delivering unique factions, and revitalizing a real-time battle formula with magic and monsters. Warhammer showed what Total War could do when it embraced creativity instead of recycling old formulas. So, by 2018, the franchise was split. On one side, you had the history purists begging for more deep, authentic games like Attila or Medieval 2. On the other, you had the Warhammer crowd, loving the bold mechanics and flashy spectacle. Creative Assembly needed a way to satisfy both of these groups, and that's when the concept of sagas came in. The idea of this new spin-off brand, Saga, was to create a smaller, more focused historical game that wouldn't span entire eras, but instead zero on a single conflict or moment in history. In theory, this would allow for deeper mechanics, richer storytelling, and more replayability. Players imagined a kind of Total War boutique experience, and Thrones of Britannia was chosen to launch that vision. I mean, the setting seemed perfect. 878 AD, right after Alfred the Great defeated the Viking invaders at the Battle of Edington. A fractured Britain, Norse settlers, Anglo-Saxon kings, Gaelic warriors, all locked in a struggle for survival and dominance. On paper, it sounded like a dream scenario, a chance for Total Total War to get gritty, personal, and immersive again. But here's the catch. By 2018, the bar for Total War was higher than ever. Fans had seen the ambition of Warhammer and the depth of Attila. They expected Thrones of Britannia to combine the best of both of these worlds, and that could be why its failure hit so hard. It wasn't just another bad game, it felt like a betrayal of the very philosophy that it claimed to embody. The announcement of Thrones of Britannia came in March of 2018, just 2 short months before release. On paper, maybe that should have been the first red flag. Total War games usually build hype over a year or more with multiple trailers, developer blogs, and previews, but Creative Assembly decided to market Thrones differently. They positioned it as a launch title for their brand new Saga series, smaller, tied to games that weren't meant to be full sequels but more than just expansions. And at the time, it was a bold experiment. They presented these Saga games as the way to zoom in on one particular conflict, with more historical detail and immersive campaign mechanics. Instead of trying to cover entire centuries, Thrones would focus on the political chaos in Britain of the year 878 AD, and that setting alone got people excited. I mean, thinking about it, Viking invasions, the resistance, the rise of Alfred the Great, and the fractured kingdom of Britain all competing for dominance. This was a story that had never really been told in a Total War game before. For history buffs, it promised a chance to dive in on one of the most fascinating and brutal chapters of early medieval Europe. For strategy fans, it promised tension, a tighter, more personal campaign experience. The trailers leaned heavily into this vision: grim narration, dark visuals, and a promise of choice-driven gameplay. Creative Assembly emphasized things like faction uniqueness. Each kingdom would feel different, with its own culture and playstyle. Political decisions. Players would supposedly deal with loyalty, governance, and internal strife. There'd be victory conditions like campaigns that wouldn't be about painting a map. They would be story-driven, tied to history. All of this sounded like a dream come true, especially for the portion of the fanbase that wanted more depth and less spectacle as compared to Warhammer. Thrones was marketed as a return to the gritty historical storytelling. Maybe a game that could recapture the atmosphere of Attila, but with sharper mechanics and new ideas. So the game released, and the community reaction, well, it was cautiously optimistic. Some fans were skeptical about the Saga branding, unsure if it was just another way to sell DLC as a standalone game, but others saw it as a fresh start. The smaller scope gave hope that Creative Assembly would polish every mechanic, dig deeper into politics and roleplay, and create Total War games that felt alive and human. This hype cycle wasn't built on flashy marketing or huge promises of scale, it was built on trust. Fans believed Creative Assembly when they said Thrones would be a tighter, smarter, and more immersive game. The expectation was that Saga games would carry the spirit of Shogun 2 or Attila, and that's exactly the issue. When Thrones of Britannia finally launched, the excitement from trailers and promises quickly gave way to something else: frustration. On paper, it looked like a fascinating experiment in historical strategy. In practice, it felt like a stripped down, recycled version of a Total War Attila, a game that had already released years before. The first thing that struck players was how familiar everything looked and even felt. The campaign map, the settlement models, even many of the animations were pulled directly from Total War Attila. Of course, reusing assets isn't inherently a bad thing. Every Total War game has done it. It was so blatant here that it just felt like you were playing a mod rather than a new title. Yet we've paid for this. It shouldn't feel like a mod. Even visually, Thrones was pretty underwhelming. In 2018, players had seen the detail and spectacular of Total War Warhammer and the ongoing improvements of Rome 2. Compared to those, Thrones felt dated the moment it launched. The lighting looked flat, environments repetitive, the battles lacked the visual punch that fans had come to expect. And that leads us on to the campaign. This campaign was supposed to be a huge selling point. Creative Assembly had promised a deep political system, unique faction mechanics, and multiple ways to win. What players got instead, though, was a campaign that felt shallow and repetitive. Faction mechanics, for example, were meant to make each kingdom feel distinct. The Anglo-Saxons, the Gaels, the Vikings, all supposedly had their own identity, but in reality, most of these mechanics boiled down to reskinned bonuses instead of radically different playstyles. You would get these minor tweaks on the same basic formula. After playing one campaign, the others started to feel eerily similar. Another disappointment came in the form of the politics system. Thrones advertised meaningful decisions and internal struggles, but the system turned out to be clunky and shallow. Loyalty issues cropped up occasionally, but they were more of an annoyance than an engaging challenge. Instead of feeling like a living, breathing court of nobles and rivals, politics in Thrones was reduced to clicking through repetitive events. And then we had the victory conditions. Instead of dynamic, story-driven campaigns, most victory paths required grinding through conquest after conquest. Many players reported that even after winning, the game felt forced to keep them expanding endlessly on arbitrary objectives. What was supposed to be focused turned into map painting fatigue, something that players thought we wouldn't be getting. Then there's the battles, and Total War lives and dies on these battles. Thrones, unfortunately though, came up short. On the surface, it had all the ingredients: shield walls, Viking warbands, Anglo-Saxon levies, but in practice, the battles felt flat and repetitive. Units across factions lacked variety. Most rosters boiled down to slightly different flavors of spearmen, swordsmen, and archers. There was no cavalry-heavy cultures, no exotic units, nothing to truly mix up the battlefield. The sameness killed replayability. No matter which faction you picked, your armies ended up looking and feeling almost identical. Players, of course, would joke saying that they had these copy-paste rosters, making battles blur together after only a few hours. This wasn't helped with the real brown, dark, dingy color palette put on the game. The pacing of the battles was another sticking point. It's never been brilliant in Total War, but units felt really sluggish here. Combat dragged and AI behavior was predictable. Enemy armies often sat back passively or made the same tactical mistakes over and over. Sieges, which should have been epic, were a particularly weak point. Long, repetitive, and frustrating. For a franchise known for epic set-piece clashes, Thrones battles simply didn't deliver. Adding to this disappointment, the game didn't even run smoothly. On release, many players reported poor optimization, crashes, and stuttering, even on high-end PCs. For a game that was essentially using Attila's engine with some tweaks, this was just baffling. Attila itself had run better for many players, and whilst patches eventually smoothed out some of the rough edges, first impressions really matter, and Thrones made a poor one. So why did it feel like a step backwards? I think the biggest problem with Thrones of Britannia wasn't that it was broken or even completely unplayable at launch, but it felt like a regression. Attila already delivered a dark, atmospheric, historical game with meaningful mechanics. Warhammer had shown how ambitious and innovative Total War could be. Compared to those, Thrones felt like half a game. Smaller in scope, weaker in execution, and lacking identity. Instead of delivering on its promise of a tightly focused immersive campaign, Thrones stripped away much of what Total War made engaging. The battles were bland, the campaign was shallow, and the whole package felt like a missed opportunity, but it was still not at a price that made people feel like it was worth the lack of content. By the time players had sunk 10 to 20 hours into Thrones, many realized they'd seen what everything the game has to offer. For a Total War title known for hundreds, if not thousands of hours of replayability, this was not good enough. And then there's the community backlash. If the gameplay disappointments of Thrones of Britannia had been minor, the community might have been forgiving. After all, Total War fans have lived through rocky launches before. Rome 2 being a disaster at launch, but over time it slowly rehabilitated its image. Even Empire Total War had passionate defenders who stuck with it, but Thrones seemed different. From the moment players got their hands on it, backlash was immediate and unforgiving. On launch day, Thrones landing a resounding thud on Steam. The game's overall rating quickly dropped to mixed and stayed there. Reviews constantly echoed the same complaints: shallow mechanics, repetitive gameplay, and feeling that it was essentially Attila light. Even some of the top voted Steam reviews summed it up brutally. "This isn't a new game," one said. "It's a £30 DLC for Attila dressed up as a full release. Every campaign feels the same. Every army feels the same. I've played mods that are more ambitious than this." Or someone even said, "The first Total War game I actually regret buying." This wasn't just a small minority. The negative reception spread fast. The word of mouth actually killed any chance of this game building momentum. The wider Total War community, especially on YouTube and Reddit, even harsher. Total War content creators who had initially covered Thrones with optimism quickly shifted tones. Videos like "Is Thrones of Britannia already dead?" and "Why Thrones Failed" popped up weeks into release. Even major strategy channels struggled to find nice things to say. I mean, the consensus was this game was just boring. And boring is one label a strategy game can never afford. On Reddit, the jokes came quickly. Players calling it Thrones of Copy and Paste, Thrones of Attila DLC, and even Thrones of Disappointment. Memes spread about the game's identical rosters, shallow mechanics, and underwhelming campaign. The backlash was so strong that even the modding community didn't embrace the game. Normally, when a Total War game struggles, mods can help fix it or keep it alive. Rome 2's Divide et Impera mod gave it a second life. Medieval 2 is still thriving today thanks to mods like Third Age or Stainless Steel, but Rome's never attracted that following. Why? Because modders saw the same problems as everybody else did. Shallow mechanics, limited scope, and it gave them little room to create ambitious overhauls. The mod scene dried up almost immediately, leaving Thrones without the grassroots support that might have salvaged its reputation. Perhaps the most lasting consequence of the backlash was the damage that it did to the Saga brand. Thrones was supposed to launch this new line of smaller, more experimental Total War titles. Instead, it poisoned the well. Fans saw Sagas not as focused and innovative, but cheap and lazy. By the time Total War Saga Troy came out, Creative Assembly had to give it away for free on the Epic Games Store. I mean, That move was seen as many to attempt to repair the Saga name, but even that didn't work. For many fans, Thrones of Britannia quickly became the low point for the modern Total War. Even years later, discussions about the franchise often include Thrones as a punchline, examples of a wasted potential or poor execution. It kind of feels like the forgotten game in the franchise. It wasn't just that the game was bad, it was that it felt unnecessary. Players didn't see the value in it, and the backlash was loud enough that Creative Assembly just quietly moved on. But when you step back and look at Thrones of Britannia, its failure wasn't caused by just one problem. It was the perfect storm of missteps, bad timing, poor communication, and shallow execution that doomed the game before it even had the chance to find its footing. By 2018, Total War fans had been spoiled. They'd been a sweeping scale of Warhammer, the gritty survival mechanics of Attila, and still evolving Rome 2. Thrones wasn't competing against obscurity. It was competing against some of the most ambitious titles in the franchise's history. Fans expected it to be polished, detailed, and innovative. Instead, it felt like a regression. Creative Assembly also introduced the Saga brand as something experimental, smaller, tighter, and more focused, but they failed to clearly explain what it meant. Many players just thought they were getting a new game with the depth of Shogun 2, just set in a smaller time period. Instead, they got a product that felt like a glorified Attila expansion sold as standalone. And that disconnect between marketing and reality fueled anger and accusations of cash grabbing. But the worst sin of Thrones was that it didn't know itself what it wanted to be. Was it a hardcore historical sim with deep politics and replayability, or was it a simplified entry point for new players? In the end, it was neither. Veterans found it shallow, oncomers found it confusing, and nobody felt satisfied. And the final nail in the coffin was that the game could have been good. A focused look at a single historical moment could be brilliant at the right price, but the execution was half-hearted. Shallow faction mechanics, repetitive campaigns, and bland battles. The game failed to deliver on its own promise. In short, it shouldn't fail because of its idea, but it did fail because of the execution. So, what happened to Thrones of Britannia? On paper, it should have been perfect. A focus on one of the most fascinating turning points in British history. A chance to zoom in on detail instead of going into the world-spanning grandiosity that other Total War games did. But it will forever be remembered for what it was, not for what it was supposed to be. It wasn't innovative enough to win over classic Total War fans. It wasn't accessible enough to capture new players, and it wasn't ambitious enough to justify being its own release, and it definitely wasn't supported enough to recover. Instead, it became a black mark on the franchise, and maybe even the start of multiple issues that Total War has come to see. A reminder that the Total War name isn't enough to carry a game on its own. Players demand depth, identity, and replayability, and Thrones delivered none of them in a way that stuck. And yet, Thrones isn't just a failure, it's a lesson. For Creative Assembly, it was a warning shot. You can't coast on recycled mechanics and half measures. For fans, it was a reality check that not every Total War game is going to be a masterpiece, and sometimes the franchise has to stumble before it figures out where it goes next. Although in Creative Assembly's case, this franchise has been stumbling for the last 10 years. We saw that lesson play out almost immediately. After Thrones, Creative Assembly doubled down with clear ambition. I mean, they kind of learned the lesson with Three Kingdoms. That did have massive popularity, and then it had a lot of DLC content with Warhammer, eventually Warhammer 3, all being successes in their books. Then it comes to the Saga games. Troy was handled, well, eventually more cautiously, but that didn't exactly work out the way they wanted to. Maybe their caution actually hurt it, once again being another disappointment. In the end, Thrones of Britannia is less of a game and more of a case study in misalignment. It was never truly terrible, it was just the expectations and the marketing and the execution, well, never seemed to be things that came together. So maybe the final answer to WTF happened to Thrones of Britannia is nothing happened. It came, it underwhelmed, and it faded into obscurity. And for a franchise built on epic stories of conquest, betrayal, and empire, fading into nothingness might just be the cruelest fate of all.